From Friday the 6th of June to Sunday the 8th of June 2014, the Green Foundation Ireland hosted a conference, a summer school, on the theme of greening the EU in the context of the Eurosceptic debate. What follows is a debate on the issue of shale gas and fracking, with Stefan Andresen of Queen's University Belfast putting the case for shale gas as a transition fuel, and Ross Brown, newly elected to Belfast City Council for the Greens, vigorously arguing against it.
Thank you very much. All right, thanks everyone for having me here and being willing to listen. I was reading the news coming over here, and on the top of the Financial Times website, there's a headline about Michael Gove, the UK Education Secretary, saying that, and I quote, he's driving the Prime Minister mad. And they went on to speculate that he may be losing his job for his efforts. So I was sort of hoping today, certainly, that I won't drive everyone mad here with my views and my efforts. But my good friend and colleague John had sort of invited me in today to be, if you will, the sunny side of fracking, or perhaps to present the sunny side of fracking, or perhaps to paraphrase a great slogan from the big ideological debates of the last century, fracking with a human face. So that's, with that we'll get going. Okay, so what I wanted to try to get across is essentially two questions that I was interested in thinking about today. And the first one is, why, first of all, does this debate about shale gas in particular, but also shale oil matter? Why are so many people interested in the potential for fracking? Not just in the United States, of course, which is our one serious test case of this so far, but in Europe and, of course, in other parts of the world where we know there are substantial recoverable deposits of shale. Okay? And secondly, and related to that, of course, which I imagine is of interest to everyone here, is the question of why, despite the obvious environmental challenges that are posed by our very large and massive use of fossil fuels, do these unconventional energy options seem attractive nevertheless? Not to everyone, of course, but to substantial parts of democratic populations in various countries. Okay? So to get at this, I wanted to do four things very quickly. I wanted to talk a little bit about the global energy picture, which comes back to this question of why this matters. Secondly, I wanted to say then a few things about the one example that we have to really look at, which is the American so-called shale revolution. You might think that's a particularly hubristic way of thinking about it, right? But that's one of the terms that's used to describe it. Thirdly, I'll say a few things about the European situation, and I want to finish then with a few points about the politics of all of this. Okay? So that's my plan for the next 15 minutes. Right, so what all this is based on essentially are two maybe not so optimistic or not so happy assumptions, and clearly there's some debate about these assumptions, and we can maybe get back to that later on. But the first one is that we're demonstrably not moving towards, right, at the global level, a post-carbon or a post-fossil fuel global economy within the foreseeable future. Right? That's pretty clear, and I'll have a few data here in a minute, irrespective of what sort of projections and what sort of data we look at, right? Energy demand based on fossil fuels is in fact steadily increasing, and it likely will continue to increase, right? With some important regional variations, the EU, of course, being one of those. Okay? That's the first assumption. Second one, perhaps slightly more controversial, is that intermittent sources of renewable energy, right, will not supply all of our energy demand. And in particular, this is because, the argument goes, they're not scalable. They're simply not scalable today or in the foreseeable future to supply that enormous rise in demand in emerging markets in particular. Right? And if this is true, then it means that the debates about renewables become less significant from the global point of view. Right? At least in terms of energy demand, right? Impacts on the environment and so on are, of course, a different story, and we'll get to that. So, if then we buy these two assumptions, which you may or may not do, if we have this reality, then it is of course a fact that using more gas from shale, for example, rather than coal and oil in particular, will at least mitigate global emissions and the overall climate impact, right? Now, okay, mitigating is not resolving very serious problems that we're facing, right? So whether or not this is at all acceptable is, of course, a matter, it's ultimately a political question, which is something that's up to democratic bodies of people to discuss and make decisions on, right? But that's sort of the assumptions that I'm using going into this. And just to illustrate this then, right, again, we have different projections using slightly different methodologies that give us slightly different curves, right? But the EIA figures are, I think, as good as any, and the story is pretty clear, right? We are going to use a lot more energy of all kinds of types over the next few decades. Okay? And the point of view then of, I suppose, the proponents of using natural gas, of fracking for gas and so on, is that if we can do anything to decrease these curves of oil and other liquids and of coal in particular, and instead boost the use of natural gas, well, then that has some positive impact, right, on overall global emissions, right? Yes, of course, if we could see the top three here sort of just fall off of the cliff, drop next to nothing, with renewables and nuclear, I suppose, shooting straight up, that would be an even better scenario, but it doesn't seem like a likely one given the projections that are out there. Okay? And why is this happening? Well, it's the most obvious point, perhaps, of why this is happening is because of that enormous shift in the center of the gravity of the global economy that's been underway for a few decades now, right? Where we see enormous growth in so-called emerging markets, be it China, India, Brazil, and elsewhere, right? That is, on one hand, lifting lots and lots of people in the world out of grinding poverty, but it's, of course, also putting tremendous pressure on the global environment, right? As everyone realizes, and certainly as people in China realize by now, when it's getting a bit hard to breathe in big cities like Beijing and so on. But this is essentially what's behind this inexorable increase in demand, right? People want development, like in the sort of standard way of thinking about and conceptualizing what development is. They need reliable baseload sources of energy and electricity to fuel that development, and that's why we have this increase in demand. Okay? That's my assumption. Okay. So let's talk about America then, the sort of the one case we have to actually look at to think about shale gas and fracking. So probably most of you know already, this is not a new technique. It's been around for quite a while. If you have been to the place in Grant County in Kansas where they sort of used this technique commercially for the first time. I wasn't there in 1947. And then it was applied from the 80s onwards by pioneers like George Mitchell in Texas, and among other places, the Barnett Shale, which is in and around Dallas and Fort Worth. Okay, so what has this resulted in then in recent years? Because it's really the last 6 years or so we're talking about when we talk about a shale gas revolution. Again, whether you see that as the next big, great thing in America or an absolute environmental disaster, it is really significant what has happened. Okay, so what's happened, among other things? Well, in terms of tight and shale oil, we see increases in production of about 56% since 2008. Right? And now the prognostications, which suggest that the US may actually overtake Russia and Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest oil producer in a few years, are rather remarkable if we think about the debates about US oil and gas industry being in terminal decline in the 80s and 90s. Okay? And in fact, in a few years, they may be back to the production peak in terms of oil that we saw previously in 1970. Okay? So that's one. Secondly, of course, as part of this, both oil and gas imports are being sharply reduced. Right? A lot of folks who sort of make a living, I suppose, betting their money on this would suggest that within the foreseeable future, Canada could become the one and only country in the world that supplies the US with crude oil imports. And that's pretty fantastic if you think about the geostrategic implications of this, right? Whether they're good or bad, they're significant, arguably. Okay? No more oil from Venezuela, potentially, no more oil from Saudi Arabia, and so on. Whatever that will do, you can certainly see in terms of the political appeal of all of this, right? This is a great story for American politicians to be able to tell the electorate, right? Because of our own increase in production and because we only have to import from friendly Canada to the north of our border, right? This is what's, we don't have to deal with Middle East and so on. West African oil exports that were by 2020 supposed to be 25% of all US imports dried up in 2 years between 2010 and 2012. Right, so that's pretty significant as well. Shale gas then amounts to about 44% today of all gas that's produced in the United States. The US will probably be a net exporter by 2016. And perhaps the more significant point here is what's happened to prices compared to other parts of the world. Oil is a truly global market, right? So sharp increases in production in one part of the world doesn't really alter prices that much. Okay? But gas prices, of course, are regional because of the costs and the technology involved in transporting it and all the rest of it. So roughly 1/3 of those in Europe and 1/5 of those in Asia. Right? Very rough numbers, and they look slightly different based on the sources you use, but I think those comparisons are fairly good. Okay? Well, what does this do then? Well, it's boosted, among other things, growth in US manufacturing, obviously in chemical companies and other energy-intensive industries. And we've also seen the phenomenon that's recently being talked about, which is the phenomenon of reshoring, right? So where companies in the past would have left the United States to take advantage of lower labor costs elsewhere, they're now coming back because of a comparative advantage in the prices they will be charged for energy. I think it's a much less clear picture in terms of what's happening to prices for consumers, but certainly you'll be paying less for electricity if you live in the United States than if you live in Germany, to take just one example. And the other thing then that's suggested is, of course, that this is creating the development of an industry that is indirectly supporting a lot of jobs outside the immediate oil and gas production. Here I think it's fair to say, and as this should suggest to anyone paying close attention, when you see about 1 to 2 million, that's pretty vague, that's pretty fussy. There's much more, obviously, disagreement on these kind of figures than there is on the actual production, what's happening to that. How much are we digging up out of the ground? How much are we importing? How much are we exporting, right? So, fair enough, these are much more controversial figures, but if you look at the mainstream sort of large-scale industry data, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and so on, that's the best I can narrow it down to. The figure of 500,000 manufacturing jobs is usually bandied about as well. Okay? And the other point here is, of course, this has important technological knock-on effects on other sectors and industries as well. And in a climate, finally, where you have quite a bit of concern about sluggish job growth and unemployment, those rates of job creation are pretty impressive. So just a few ways to illustrate this in terms of why people talk about this in terms of being a revolution in production. There's one showing the shale gas. There's the very nice one which shows you that comparative advantage for energy-intensive industries in the United States vis-a-vis its main industrial competitors. Okay? And finally, in terms of U.S. energy security, right, this move away from being a net importer to an exporter. Okay? So just a few ways of sort of illustrating that. The UK situation is not, of course, identical to or synonymous with the European situation, more broadly speaking, but the difference is rather stark, right? That's what's happened in terms of gas production and the supply met by imports in the UK in recent years. And of course, right, even though Europe is by far the great success story in terms of increasing the use of renewables, there will be a lot more, there will be reliance for a very long time to come on gas imports as well. I still think they supply more than half of European energy, but someone else might know more about that. So, quickly then, the European situation. So the first thing to say is that, of course, it's different from the United States. And of course, it would be naive and sort of ridiculous to say, hey, here's what happened in the US, and assuming we like what's happened in the US, now let's start fracking for gas in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and lo and behold, we'll have the same outcomes. Of course not, right? Many important differences. The geology differs across the world in terms of how easy or how difficult it is to get the gas or the oil out of shale formations. As the Chinese have found out, they're the big prize in a way. They sit on the biggest reserves, but they're in areas where it's difficult to get access to sufficient water, it's mountainous, it's far away from infrastructure, so there's a lot of those factors there that work against China. If we go back to Europe, the demography, of course, plays a role, right? On the whole, Europe and parts of Europe where the shale is to be found is much more densely populated than the parts of the United States where most of the fracking activity occurs. That said, they are fracking at the campus of the University of Texas, Dallas, and at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport and so on, which are in dense urban areas. But there are important differences. Societal attitudes, of course. Parts of the U.S., like Louisiana, where I used to live, have a long history of extractive industries and a relatively high tolerance to this. This is what we do. It's part of our heritage, in a different sense of thinking about our heritage, I suppose. This is an industry that we're used to having around and we're happy to embrace, and so on. And, of course, our technological differences, right? Where, for example, are all the rigs that you would need in Europe to come from, right? The engineering expertise and so on. Okay. So, important differences. But, that said, there are, of course, significant and recoverable deposits across Europe. Ideally, I should have had a map of that, but I don't. The question is, of course, are we willing to try to get at them? Okay? And just as one example, right, is the Bowland Hodder Shale Formation, which is sort of across from Lancashire to Yorkshire in the north of England. Right? I don't know exactly how accurate these numbers are, but it's the British Geological Survey, and they know better than me certainly, have estimated maybe 1,300 trillion cubic feet of gas. Small numbers of a small percentage of that presumably would ever be likely to be recovered, but even a small percentage compared to all the gas that's been extracted would be fairly significant, I imagine. Okay? And so then there are the arguments along with this that a country like the UK, which perhaps is leading the curve here, if that's the way to think about it, on pushing to get fracking underway, could have lots of benefits beyond just the production benefits, right? Expertise developing in the UK and in UK companies that then could be used in other parts of Europe and so on. There's also the argument that states tend to capture greater tax revenues on energy that's domestically produced as opposed to being imported, and that's, of course, extra tax revenues that could be used for a whole host of beneficial things, maybe subsidizing renewables or perhaps better yet, spending money on research and development for other alternatives. Okay. And finally, the question that's asked is recently, the EU has apparently, and again, I'm happy to be corrected if this is wrong, the EU is now apparently considering to change some law or directive which makes it possible to import oil from Canada that comes from tar sands. And if that's the case, if we're willing to do that, and if we're willing, of course, to import increasing amounts of coal from the United States and so on, why not frack for gas, right? A less bad alternative. So, that's some of the arguments. Very quickly, running on too long here, the Russian factor then. Okay? So as we know, for the last several decades, Russia has been operating pretty much as a classic petro-state, using its energy resources, of which it has a whole lot, right, as an instrument for its geostrategic ambitions, right? So we have a great concern about this all around Europe, which of course predates the recent events in Ukraine as well, although they have exacerbated this. Problem there is the Gazprom, right, which is the big actor in Russia, okay, and the numbers on this are sort of hard to come by, supplies probably at the very least a quarter of Russian tax revenue, right? It's also a very corrupt and compared to its Western competitors, very inefficient company, right? This means it very much depends on a high gas price to be able to generate the sort of revenues that it has been generating for the Russian state, okay? And you see some of the comparisons there. Therefore, right, Russia, maybe for obvious reasons, and Gazprom being an arm of the Russian state, considers any sort of significant development of shale gas in Europe as a threat for a variety of reasons, okay? Although it is, of course, willing to invite Western companies to exploit or look into exploiting its own considerable shale reserves. So, a similar argument here then again. If we want less dependence on Russian gas, we want less use of coal and oil, well then gas from shale is one significant alternative. Although it should also be said very quickly that if we would have a rapid sort of production increase in gas in Western Europe because of fracking, for example, it is probably much more likely to displace imports from Qatar in the short run anyways than imports from Russia, which will remain significant. And finally, the political dimension then, to sum this up. So the argument is as follows, right? So at the global level, this is coming back to the first few slides, right? There are, in the significant markets of energy demand and energy growth, no electoral mandates in favor, right, of renewables in the sense of a rapid marginalization of fossil fuels, okay? In other words, where developmental needs are urgent, reliable and cheap energy will trump environmental concerns. And we can, of course, see this in terms of just plans in China and India and elsewhere for a whole host of new coal-fired plants. Maybe at some point that cost-benefit calculus will change in places like China, right, which now is relatively cash-rich and can devote more money to research and development, and who is in very obvious ways starting to feel the strain, the environmental strains of its developmental path. Right? And what about Europe? The argument here, I suppose, is as follows, right? By now, a highly indebted continent, we're likely to have sluggish economic growth rates for the foreseeable future. We have historically high levels, right, of unemployment, youth employment in particular, right? In that sort of a scenario, right, can any additional boosts to economic growth be handily dismissed by politicians, right? Again, it's sort of a difficult question. And finally, the point is that renewables become in many ways cost effective by means of generous state subsidies, which of course some countries are willing to pay and are able to pay, right? But could not perhaps some of these resources be directed to R&D on, for example, new generation nuclear plants, which now can be built at much lower costs in China and the US than apparently they can be in Europe, in order to improve the choice and the alternatives in a lower carbon energy mix for the future. So that's the presentation, and hopefully this will help to generate some debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. So, Ross, I'm going to call on you straight away. Okay.
Okay, thanks for having me speak today. I'm going to respond to some of what Stefan has said, but also outline a number of key points as well. And I really, to go give you an outline of what I'm going to say, is really to make the case that fracking is backing. Fracking is the wrong horse, and it's a lock-in fuel. It's going to keep us locked into a fossil fuel-based economy, and it's not the solution to our energy needs. I'm going to also make the case about the economics of fracking, and describe how I see it as a subprime energy and why that is the case, and what is the alternative. And they also look at the artificial nature of low prices that actually have developed in America. I'll address very briefly the issues of the environment. I'm sure many people already are aware of them, but I'll outline some of those issues. Touch on climate change as well, and disagree very strongly with what Stefan has said with regards to the comparative benefit of shale gas. And also to then just follow up with a conclusion to really say that political decisions are going to determine our energy trajectory and our energy demand for the future, and it's not a given. So really to talk about the economics, first of all, the economics of fracking are hard. That's coming from a US financial journalist, Wolf Richter, writing in Business Insider. And why is that? Why are we saying that the economics are hard? Well, in June 2011, it started to come to light when the New York Times released an investigation that first unearthed some major cracks in the shale boom, or so-called shale boom narrative, where many companies actually in America had been intentionally or illegally overstating the productivity of their wells and the size of their reserves. we have had since this date the US Marcellus Shale reserves, the biggest area in the United States, downgraded by 80%, the amount of reserves that were there. Polish shale reserves downgraded by 85% in February 2012. The shale reserves in India downgraded by 90% in May 2012. And also downgrades, which I haven't got the figures for, of shale gas in the UK and other places in Europe. There's strong basis for the doubts that were there's a strong basis for reasonable doubts about the reliability and durability of the reserves that would have been projected. And why has this been the case? Well, actually, in 2009, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States deregulated the calculation of reserves and actually the audit of the reserves. The new rules allowed gas companies to claim reserve sizes without an independent third party coming in and actually verifying that those reserves existed. We've also witnessed in the actual productivity rates of the shale gas wells that they have very steep decline rates, 85% in the first year. And what we've seen is that actually where companies have actually entered as what has been described by David Hughes as a US US geologist as a drilling treadmill, whereby they have had to drill new wells to pay off for the debts to pay for the old wells. And how has this started to manifest itself? Well, let's actually look at some of the evidence of what has happened with the companies in the United States. We've had the former chief executive of Shell, Peter Voster, who resigned from his post last year, and he said that it was the bet on shale gas was his biggest regret as the CEO. Shell was forced to take a $2 billion write-down in September 2013. We've had the BG Group was forced to take a $1.3 billion write-down in its US natural gas assets. And Chesapeake Energy, one of the biggest shale gas producers in the States, found itself really in a crisis with the amount of debt that it has, staggering under high debt, as reported in the Washington Post, and it sold off $6.9 billion of its gas fields and pipelines. So what has actually happened in the States, in many respects, when you start to look at and examine the economics, was a serious glut in the overall supply of shale gas, which actually artificially brought the price down. Admittedly, yes, making the US more competitive in energy costs for the meantime. But the question is, how long will that actually last? When you actually look at the feasibility of shale gas in Europe and the costs at which we would need to actually to sell the gas in order to meet the costs of producing it. Well, some research has actually come out. The German Economic Research Institute, ZEW, said shale gas will only become economically viable if the price of gas reaches 15.6 to 19.5 million cubic feet, whilst the current price of gas is only $10.5 per, that's 1,000 cubic feet. Wood Mackenzie also did an analysis for the UK, a different measurement this time, but they estimated in order to develop UK shale gas reserves, the potential operators would need a gas price of $9.68 per million British thermal units for the project to make economic sense, and this is considerably more than this year's average spot price of $8.69. So actually, it doesn't even make economic sense based on the analysis that has been done. Where am I? Sorry. Yes. Okay. To talk a wee bit about the issue of pricing, a lot of the narrative out there to promote shale gas is that it will actually lower prices for consumers. And actually, again, when you start to look at the analysis and the research that's coming out from Europe, Bloomberg New Energy Finance predicted that the shale gas exploitation in the UK is unlikely to result in low natural gas prices. The Grantham Institute concluded similarly that it is unlikely that gas consumers would see much, if any, benefit in terms of reduced gas and electricity bills. And even Quadrilla, the PR company for Quadrilla Resources, one of the the operators that are proposing shale gas development said that it would have a basically insignificant insignificant impact on prices. So really, it's not going to have an impact on prices. And then let's talk about the issue of energy security as well. Because when you look at the research, 2011, a report came out of the European Parliament which stated shale gas can only make a small or even marginal contribution to European energy supply. Again, Wood Mackenzie, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, both predicted that the impacts of shale gas are based on very optimistic assumptions and exclude the costs of building the necessary infrastructure. And they both concluded unanimously that shale gas assets, Sorry, I don't know where I lost my notes here. So again, as I say, the question of energy security is very much doubted for all of these issues. I then want to touch briefly on the issue of the environmental impact of shale gas. First, to say a bit about climate change, because I think this is one of the most important issues. When you actually look at the greenhouse gas impact, the life cycle greenhouse gas impact from developing shale gas, research is now firmly suggesting that it is as high as burning hard coal. There is no advantage to burning shale gas as there is to burning coal. And much of this has to do with the fact that a lot of the methane actually leaks out of the wells. You have to drill an enormous number of wells. It's not the same as conventional gas resources, because you have to drill into rock and physically stimulate that rock to release the gas. And in doing so, I'll give you one example just from here in Ireland. Fermanagh and Leitrim alone, the single operator there proposes up to 9,000 wells. This is a massively intensive process, and it requires the drilling of many more boreholes when compared to conventional gas. When you drill a borehole, the problem is that you create pathways for migration of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas which is 86 times, over a 20-year time period, is 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So releasing anything more than around 2 to 3% of the overall amount that you're actually burning when you're actually drilling, transporting, or processing that methane makes the shale gas life cycle as bad as burning hard coal. And initially there was many estimates that come out there from the likes of the US Environmental Protection Agency, suggesting that it perhaps wasn't as bad for in terms of the greenhouse gas impact. But so many of those estimates are now being discredited by measurements, and the research that's coming out now, where they've actually measured the rates of methane leakage, is suggesting that there is a serious problem in the United States. Recently, we had one that came out from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration from the United States, suggesting far higher release of methane gas than had been initially estimated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And in a journal article in April, the journal being the National Academy of Sciences, they released an article that has measured methane rates of leakage 50 to 100 times higher than had been initially estimated. So this is a serious problem that has not been got to grips with. And I think in terms of greenhouse gas impacts, there is absolutely no question that what we're experiencing is a serious problem with shale gas. To touch on some of the other environmental impacts, I mean, many people have actually seen them, but they're serious. I've already mentioned that this is a far more intensive process than extracting conventional oil and gas. And to give you some quotes from some of the scientists, I mean, we have got Dr. Ronald Bishop, in a study for the State University of New York, has said it's highly likely to degrade air, surface water and groundwater quality, to harm humans, and to negatively impact aquatic ecosystems. Mitigation measures can reduce but not eliminate this harm. The Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, they released a report, and they said there's insufficient evidence to confirm that risks can be suitably reduced or managed within acceptable levels. The precautionary principle must apply. We had Dr. Michelle Bamberger and Robert Oswald said, without rigorous scientific studies, the shale gas drilling boom sweeping the world will remain an uncontrolled health experiment on an enormous scale. Professor Tony Ingraffia, one of the engineers at the forefront of actually his whole speciality is rock fractures and rock mechanics. He said, where shale gas development has not yet occurred, ban it, period. Where it is occurring, enact ironclad regulations, inspect for compliance with them, with dog diligence, and enforce them relentlessly with fines that really mean something. So as I say, there's some really serious environmental issues, and these are starting to be recognised even by insurance companies, who are probably the best people to actually tell us the extent of the concern. Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company in the United States said, after months of research and discussion, we have determined that the exposures presented by hydraulic fracturing are too great to ignore. Risks involved with hydraulic fracturing are now prohibited for general liability, commercial auto, motor truck cargo, auto physical damage, and public auto insurance coverage. So as you can see, even insurers themselves are not happy. To say just very briefly, I'm just going to look back here just 2 seconds, just to see if I missed anything here. Well, what is the alternative? And we haven't addressed what the alternative really is. And I think the best example of what the alternative could be is looking at what's going on in Germany. The German Federal Government Advisory Council on the Environment have said, after a major study looking into this, shale gas is not essential for transforming the energy system. For the moment, the fracking technology should not be used for commercial production of shale gas in view of serious gaps in our knowledge about its environmental impacts. Production of shale gas in Germany will not reduce energy prices, neither will it make any appreciable contribution to the security of energy supply. From the point of view of German energy policy, there therefore can be no interest in such production. Present knowledge indicates that the domestic potential for economically profitable extraction subject to appropriate environmental conditions is far too small to have any appreciable impact on gas prices in Germany. They did a major study, obviously looking at the German energy transformation, which has obviously incorporated renewable energy and energy efficiency standards. And it is possible. It is possible to have that energy transformation. Work by researchers in Stanford University and the University of California have demonstrated that we can move to 100% renewable energy by 2030. There is no technological impediments to doing so, only political barriers. And in terms of cost of all this, well, again, McKinsey & Company, ECF, the Energy Futures Lab, and Oxford Economics and Imperial College London did a major study looking at the costs of going 100% renewable by 2050, and they found that the costs of energy would be no higher than it would be under a high carbon business as usual regime by that date. So I want to just finish off, as I said previously, the political decisions will determine demand for energy, demand for fossil fuels going forward. It is not a given that those trajectories need go up. It is about politics. And as I say, there is no technological impediments. In terms of costs, when you look at onshore wind, the projections are that they will reach break-even cost price by 2016, and already the impact of renewable energy is starting to have an impact, a downward pressure on the marginal cost of wholesale electricity prices. Renewables are mature technology, but we also crucially have to also look at how we can reduce our energy demand. So, as I say, hopefully that gives you some idea. I can talk much more, as you say, many more notes. I can talk all weekend about this, and if you want any, we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, Russ.
This has been a Join the Coup production for the Green Foundation Ireland. To find out more, visit their website greenfoundationireland.ie.